following podcast is for informational purposes only. The contents of this podcast do not constitute tax, legal, or investment advice. Take responsibility for your own decisions, consult with the proper professionals, and do your own research.
So as like a roll-up, both on the Linea side and on the scroll side, I have to have graph because there are so many like existing dApps that we would want on our chain, right, to port over that require the graph. There are so many new use cases and new dApps that will need a product like the graph in order to succeed.
GRTiQ podcast.
We're like astronauts floating in the space of time. Lost between the past and future.
Welcome to the GRTiQ podcast. Today I'm speaking with Emily Lin, Developer Relations at Scroll, an L2 scaling solution for Ethereum. Scroll aims to provide a more efficient and scalable platform for Ethereum transactions, enabling greater adoption and usability. During this interview, Emily shares her journey into the tech and Web3 space. We begin by discussing Emily's background and how she discovered her interest in computer science. She then recounts her experiences working at various tech companies, including her time at Appian, her early entrepreneurial ventures, and how she got started at ConsenSys working on Linea before her recent move to Scroll. We also explore the importance of L2s and Emily's perspective on why the graph is essential to her work, both at Linea and now at Scroll, as a DevRel supporting various ecosystems and builders. I started the conversation by asking Emily where she's from.
I am born and raised in Texas, near the Dallas area, so I grew up in the burbs. Take what you will from that, I guess. All the stereotypes of a girl from American burbs trying to make it out in the big city probably apply to me. So,
And what were some of those early interests as you were growing up? Did you have hobbies or things that sort of interested you as a young person?
so I did a lot of different extracurricular activities. I can say off the bat, I was not active. So anything requiring hand-eye coordination was not my hobby. But I did various types of things. So like I did a bit of dance and like ballet, did some like musical stuff. So I grew up playing piano and violin and a bit of ukulele. I don't know. What else did I do? Songwriting, kind of like about dumb stuff. So not actual music, but like the YouTube people who make like songs about really mundane things. I guess an example is I had really bad constipation one time. So then I wrote a song about ukulele. Yeah, that was my claim to fame freshman year of high school. Dumb little things like that.
This idea about people being interested in music and then somehow ending up in tech, coding, and building. There's enough of a list of guests that have that same background that makes me suspicious that there's some link between being interested in music and eventually kind of finding your way into coding. Have you ever thought about that link? I mean, is there a correlation there in your own life?
Okay, just to not misrepresent myself, I'm actually not super into music. I would say like music was something my parents forced me into, like enrich myself as a child. I think songwriting was more so I liked the writing process. So if I was going to say on the creative side, I'm more of a writer. I have a personal blog right now, which will be secret forever. So don't ask me what it's called. It is a common thing. I think there is a link in the sense of it's just a creative aspect, right? Like at least tech from a coding perspective is all about creating a program, I guess, an application at the end. And there's a lot of building blocks that go to it. And in the same way that I think like creating art does, right? You're putting in effort and thought and things like that, and you come out with an outcome. How you get there is a little, I guess, different when you're using a right brain, left brain. But
So when did you first become interested in tech? When did that fire get lit?
I guess in college, this is also a funny story. I took my first computer science course, I think it was sophomore year of high school, and I hated it. I was like, I'm never going to go into engineering or tech or whatever. This is the worst thing in the world. So then I went to college and I started off being like, oh, maybe I'll be a doctor. And then I took a biology class and I was like, I hate this. So then I went to Dartmouth, which is like very econ heavy. So it's like, you know what? It seems like everyone nowadays wants to be a consultant. Obviously, the sexiest job ever. And then I took econ one and I was like, I was trying to evaluate like, what do I want out of my job? I think the catchphrase was, I don't want to wear a suit to work. So what enables me that opportunity? I was like, okay, you know what? Tech is really big. It might be something I want to explore. I heard that basically that quarter, a very popular teacher was teaching the Intro to CS course. So I was like, you know what, Emily, I'll try it out. I won't say I fell in love with it immediately, but what I really liked again was that creative aspect of it, like going in and the class being about creating projects versus being measured kind of on a, like test basis. I get a lot of like test anxiety, I'm going to be honest to you, like multiple choice gives me the hives. So there was an element of like it's a bit slower paced in that sense. But yeah, I think that's kind of when I fell in love with like knowing that this was a bit of my call, or at least like my first entry point into what my career might look like post graduation.
Longtime listeners of the podcast know that I always like to ask this follow-up when somebody studied computer science in college, as you mentioned there, you did at Dartmouth. Did you come across any Web3, crypto, blockchain type themes during your study that would have sort of primed you for what you're doing now?
That's a super interesting question because the answer is no, but yes, I should have. So I think two things, right? Like, I think within the standard track at Dartmouth, like there was no mention of blockchain. My first interaction with blockchain was actually like, I guess the Bitcoin bull run, like in 2016, 2017. So that was smack dab of like when I was, I guess, a poor college student. So I never really gave any thought to putting money in anything other than my education. Obviously regrets now, right? But that was kind of my first exposure. Though ever since joining like Web3 professionally, we do have like a group chat called like Dartmouth and Crypto. It's actually quite big. One of the co-founders of LivePeer was one of my friends from Dartmouth. He was doing blockchain research at the time. So like that's another aspect of like I should have known because I should talk to my friends. but maybe it's good that we never talked about like our work and we just chatted about our lives and things outside of academia. I don't know. So
if you go back then to that frame of mind you had in college, you're pursuing computer science. You said, one of the criteria is you don't want to wear a suit. You didn't want to become a doctor. You didn't fall into the kind of econ track. What was the vision for your career at that stage? I mean, were you thinking, I'll be a tech entrepreneur, I'll just go find a job 8 to 5, work at a big tech firm, or were you even thinking that far ahead?
Talking about being an American burb kid, I mean, like, honestly, I think I followed the very standard immigrant child experience. I'm not sure how many people would like resonate with this, right? But just to dive into like parents expect a very rigid lifestyle. Like your goal is to have a stable income, good hours, like stable job, which really only like opens you up to like doctor, lawyer, engineer. And kind of those three, engineer was the thing that made the most sense. So my frame of reference was like, what is a safe job that will set me up for like, I guess you could say it was like work hard, play hard, or work to live and not live to work was my mindset at the time. I later realized, and this is why in crypto now, the mantra has flipped. I don't know if we'll get into like the change of like my philosophy from live to work versus work to live. To be honest, like frankly, I was a very norming person. I was like, okay, yeah, my dream is to work a 9 to 5. Maybe I go into engineering. I think product was something I would probably be more interested in from the level of like, I definitely didn't want to spend my entire life like coding. I felt like I had skills outside of that would better serve me in more of like a cross-functional role. I did one internship as like a product intern, and my gut feeling was like, I feel like the most competent product managers have an engineering background. Not to throw shade on any product managers who don't have an engineering background. At least like for me personally, in terms of like developing my ideal career path, I was like, okay, well, yeah, going into full-time engineer, I think would help me build context for being like more successful later on. So that's kind of how I was framing my thought process.
When I started this podcast and began shining a light on people like you building in Web3, one of the things I didn't anticipate, but has happened time and time again, is I interview the children of immigrants. So this theme has come up a lot. And I'm starting to pick up on some of the things you just mentioned there, but can you just share, and I've asked other guests to do the same, how being a child of immigrants kind of shaped the way you approach career and how you spend your time?
I think, to put it frankly, like a lot of immigrant parenting is just discipline. I'm very, I guess you could say, stereotypical, like Asian girl. Mom, dad wanted me to like only care about grades and college and success in like the traditional sense financially and things like that, which I think has shaped my career from the perspective of like, I think in order to be successful, there is a level of discipline needed, like setting yourself up with the correct building blocks, understanding the path to get there. On the flip side, though, I think this is probably also why I might have ended up in crypto or just like generally non-traditional roles, is like growing up in a disciplined environment, I think can take you two ways, right? You're either like always disciplined or you get really angry at the system. You're like, F this mom and dad, I'm going to go do something you don't understand and like exert my own independence as an individual um, and do something wild and unrestrained. And yeah, and I think that's probably part of it too, right? Like being an immigrant child, I think led me to having the foundation in order to achieve things that I wanted to. But on the other hand, like feeling stifled kind of fired the vengeful spirit that makes me want to do other things.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. And again, I think I've heard some of that in some of the prior interviews I've done with children of immigrants. And so I appreciate you kind of sharing that insight about your experience. So let's return then to your story here. You're at university, you do computer science. What did you do after you graduate?
Yeah. So my very first job after school was I was just a back-end engineer at a low-code software company called Appian. So I don't know how many people are familiar with like low-code industry, and just as like a high level, it's kind of like basically adding on an abstraction layer so non-coders can code, right? So it's like low amount of code. That comes in different levels. There's like no code where you don't need to know how to code at all. So that might be like a Squarespace. Low code is kind of the intermediary. We were a B2B SaaS, so our customers were people like the government or big financial institutions. So yeah, I mean, I was just like your standard engineer there. That was my very first job. At that time, I think when I was getting back to the like, oh, this is not what I want to do full time. Like, and I predicted that in college, right? This is me setting myself up for success later on in a product job. And so that's when I kind of like started thinking like, okay, what are my next moves? How do I pivot? This is a bit, I think, where I took a weird turn at the same time of holding my engineering job. I think about, was it 1 or 2 years in, I started a beverage business. The external kind of messaging is like, I was so passionate about gut health. After discovering probiotic drinks in Malaysia, I knew I just had to bring it to the States. Especially with the rise of the functional beverage market in kombucha, there was a prime opportunity to hit the market running with this new product that didn't taste like kombucha but had all the same benefits with a different bacterial profile that did not create the same vinegary aftertaste. Okay. Anyways, that's like externally, right? But like internally, my head was like, okay, I need like experience to either like put on my resume or like, either to go to business school or like be in product or whatever. And it was kind of like a two-pronged thing, right? I was like definitely very interested in like what it would look like to explore a different industry. I think I had been so locked into tech and I wasn't fully happy that I was like, you know what I really love? I love food. So maybe I should work in food. So that was a bit of an experiment. There was another part of like, yeah, I wanted to see what it was like to build something on my own rather than kind of be like a TaskRabbit-ish character where like features come in and then I just implement. And then it's one of the things I was like, yeah, I mean, if the business takes off, it would be amazing to get sold to Coca-Cola. I mean, but worst case scenario, it's a really cool story I can tell on a podcast and put on my resume and then apply for other jobs that are also stable. But like require a more multifaceted background. I don't know. I did a bit of that actually as well. And then I also did a third thing. So basically, what happened was I started that. So I started building that out for a year. And I think people are impressed. I think my life has kind of been a hack. I got very lucky because I launched my beverage business through a food incubator in DC. And they were pretty cool because they had a commercial kitchen, a distribution center. So they distributed to like Whole Foods and other local grocery stores and like East Coast chains, as well as specialty kind of boutique grocery stores in the DC, Virginia area. The founder of that incubator was a Dartmouth alum. So, when people are like, college is so expensive, I'm kind of like, yeah, but sometimes you just pay to know one person. And that was my one person. So, yeah, I got really lucky because, beverage was something I was interested in doing. I had no idea how to get started. So I was just kind of looking into incubators in the first place. And I just found this guy on the top 10 incubators to look into on Google. And I was like, oh, this guy went to my school. So then I went through the alumni directory and we got chatting. And yeah, I built out, I developed the product and we launched in a few of the grocery stores nearby. First off, his boutique grocery stores, as well as I was in some local coffee shops and another little chain. And so that was a really interesting, I think, process going from brewing drinks in my home. That's really, really funny. It naturally carbonates. So at one point I didn't handle it properly and I opened it and the pop hit the ceiling and all the soda spread out all over the top of my ceiling. But I was like, oh no, hopefully when the super comes in and is evaluating security deposit, they don't look up. You know what I mean? And I don't know, my security deposit was fine. So I think they didn't notice the stain on the ceiling. I'm getting ahead of myself. I don't know what I was saying.
Well, let me ask you this. What did you learn about entrepreneurship by virtue of that experience? Did you learn, I want to be an entrepreneur, I want to continue on that track?
Yeah, I think there was an element of maybe entrepreneurship is down the line in my future. I think what I realized then was in order to grow to the next step, I was actually about to quit my engineering job to do this full time because I guess I sort of landed a big contract that didn't go through because of COVID. Was the next steps was I would need to hire and I would need to basically invest a lot of capital into upgrading my machinery, right? I'm fine with the capital aspect. The thing that really scared me was hiring people because I was still in such a shaky stage where I wasn't even sure if I was fully committed to it. Transparently, this all started out as a resume builder, right? And it just became more successful than I expected. But to that point, it was oh my God, I am not even 25 and I'm going to put someone on payroll and feel responsible for their life and, their livelihoods. And I think that was kind of a responsibility, at least at that age, I wasn't ready to accept. But what I did really enjoy about my job that kind of solidified my suspicions was from before is I just really liked the experimental aspect of it, right? Not knowing what was happening next, doing very different things that stretched my brain in ways that I hadn't done before. And the last part too is not even necessarily about running businesses, but just the components of the business that I like the most. So I absolutely hate paperwork. That's what I learned about myself. That's the worst thing. You probably have to do that everywhere, no matter what, if you're an entrepreneur. My favorite part of the job was going into grocery stores and demoing the beverage to people and getting their reactions, seeing what resonated and what didn't. I think one of the interesting things was okay, the easiest way to understand it is compare us to kombucha, right? But the problem we were trying to solve was taking away the ick factor that came with kombucha from people who weren't comfortable with that. And what does that look like in terms of branding and explanation and basically customer education, right? And then in general, just chatting with people about their lives and maybe they'll dive into why they're interested in functional beverages. But I don't know, that was a really fun part. And I was okay, yeah, I know regardless of wherever I am in my career next, I definitely want to be people focused.
The GRTiQ podcast is made possible by a generous grant from the Graph Foundation. The Graph Grants program provides support for protocol infrastructure, tooling, gaps, subgraphs, and community building efforts. Learn more at thegraph.foundation. That's thegraph.foundation.
Hi, this is GRTiQ, and thank you for listening. Listeners who enjoy this content can help support the GRTiQ podcast by leaving a review or a 5-star rating wherever they download podcasts, by sharing episodes on social media, or by simply telling a friend or colleague about something they heard or learned from one of our guests. It's support from listeners like you that make it possible for us to keep shining a light on the people and stories behind Web3 and the graph.
Roger that.
So you mentioned earlier that you sort of came across or were aware of Bitcoin in 2016, 2017 when you were in college. Take us back in time to when you actually became interested in it as a tech, whether it be Bitcoin or Ethereum. But do you remember that kind of light bulb moment or experience with it all?
Yeah. So I would definitely say everything kind of ebbs and flows with the market, right? So it was when I guess maybe it was 2021-ish is like when NFT summer hit. And for me, I think that's when it really clicked because, I was never really interested in the financial part of it. But what really excited me about NFTs was specifically like ownership for creators. Like I said before, I had like creative aspirations. I had friends who like are artists and like especially like digital art when it comes to like how do I attribute ownership? How do I like monetize something that is so easily replicable? Is that the word? That made sense to me, right? And the other part of it was, to be honest, I only really like rediscovered that because I moved in with my sister in, I don't remember what the year is, but her backstory is she also heard about Bitcoin during that time, got really excited about it, stayed in it. The other part of my story, I guess, is my sister was the first person to get into DevRel at a crypto company. So obviously, when I was going through my quarter life crisis and trying to figure out what I want to do, I call up Big Sis. Well, okay, I was living with her, so I just like went in her room. But I was like, hey, I need to figure out what I want to do with my life. And it became like a really process of like, okay, what did you like about your previous job? And like I said, I liked that I was stretching my brain in different ways. I think the thing I didn't like about being like an engineer at B2B SaaS was like people were all there just to like get their, like make a living and then go home, right? I had really intelligent, like fun, nice coworkers, but I never felt like we were working towards some bigger mission, which I think was hard for me to like get excited about going in. And the other point was like I had heard about NFTs happening. I was like, oh, this is cool. But then I was lucky to basically like live with a person who was familiar with the space, was much more interested. At that time, she was actually working at Facebook before it was Meta, but she was like, I guess, tangentially part of or like close to like the Libra project and things like that. So I kind of had like a crypto enthusiast in my own home. And I think through that, I got to talk with her more. Things made sense. I was also like, something I was wanting to do in my next job was like, oh, so I want to be like connected to creators and see what like the next generation of like interacting with the world looks like. And so the whole story of like Decentraland, I think was actually the second coolest thing I thought. I was like, oh my God, I have to buy land, right? Like, this is so sick. Like, I want to be in a virtual reality world where I can like meet my coworkers in person online or online, but face to face. And like all the interesting, sexy things that came along with like imagining that space. How reachable it is in the immediate future is still question mark, right? But I think that was kind of like if I want to be somewhere where no one kind of knows what they're doing, but everyone kind of knows what they're doing in that sense, and like discovering new frontiers or just like interacting with really intelligent people working on things that they're passionate about, like crypto seemed like a good place to work. That's when I first got hooked and pilled. And in general, I'm very bad at doing things on my own. I need like deadlines, if that makes sense. So I was like, okay, I could research Web3 on my own, or I could just try and get a job and make it my job to like learn about it. I felt like that was my path of least resistance. I don't know. So I was fortunate to be looking for a job at like one of the height of the bull. I think it was 2022, like early, like in January-ish, right? Where essentially I was like, okay, I'm ready for the next stage of my career. I had two priorities, right? The first thing was I want to be either a DevRel, which after talking to my sister, I felt like was kind of that good marriage between, being technical, but also like a bit like massaging pitch or customer education that I got from working in food and like that human element to it that I really liked. Or I wanted to work in crypto, which fulfilled that like I'm working on something really interesting with passionate people. The ideal situation is I would like to do both, but I have experience in neither, right? I have like tangential things that made sense for each one that I could like create a story around. But in terms of like actual line item on my resume, that didn't exist, right? So I kind of just like threw the net of like DevRel job, crypto job, DevRel crypto job. Who knows? I'll pray and like, I don't know, give sacrifices to the LinkedIn lords and see if anything comes out of it. And I was really fortunate because I guess at the time, Web3 was definitely hiring a lot. It was pretty easy. I don't want to sound arrogant. A lot of interviews were coming in, I guess, like offers too, from like DevRel and crypto, which really surprised me. I'm going to say it's because I wrote a really good cover letter. So my first job in crypto was at Truffle at ConsenSys. So Truffle is like a smart contract developer tooling project. They were the, I think, very first smart contract developer tool for Ethereum in its like history, I guess. Yeah, I was talking to one of my coworkers and they were like, yeah, Emily, one of the reasons we really liked you is your cover letter. So anytime someone asks me for career advice, yeah, I'm like, okay, yeah, you should write a cover letter. I think it was definitely like a bit of luck and timing for sure. That interview was, I think, one of my favorite because it's very practical. The way it was set up was like, teach us a technical topic. And then they also just asked like, why are you interested in Web3 and stuff like that. I don't know. My impression of the space is like people are still so open and excited to like onboard anybody who has like some minimum interest that getting a job in Web3 isn't as scary. For me, at least in my process, I was like, oh God, I need to have been like a crypto degen to fit into the space and like have discovered Bitcoin when it was still on the Minecraft servers in order to like, you know what I mean? But during my job hunting process and then also my time at ConsenSys and like being in this space, I feel like that's not true at all. I remember when I was like kind of opening up roles for hiring and I was talking to a recruiter about like, what are you looking for, Emily? And like a person to bring on. And I was like, honestly, spunk. That's a horrible like thing to tell a recruiter to like screen for, but I'm like, there's something there that I think spunk encapsulates from like it rhymes with cypherpunk, which I think is like the crypto value maybe, but like that's an arbitrary thing. But like, yeah, just like excitement and like execution. I think something I tell people if you want to work in crypto, you obviously like you have to be okay with working really weird hours. Because it's such an international industry. Like I was used to always working with like purely US people. And now my team is all across the world. We all try to make it work with each other's time zones and stuff like that. I would not say Web3 in its current iteration is for the faint-hearted if you really want to go like balls to the wall, which is why it requires spunk. And a little bit of youth, maybe.
Well, let's talk about your time at ConsenSys. So you said you got started there. You started working on Truffle. What other projects did you work on? And how was that experience there? What did you learn about Web3 by virtue of going to work at ConsenSys?
Truffle was like the very first. So I did not know how to write a smart contract going into ConsenSys, which is also like kind of crazy. But actually it's not, because it's a pretty common, I think, paradigm in engineering in general. It's like once you know how to code, you know how to code in any language. That was the very first thing I learned was like, how do I build dApps? What does it look like to, go from smart contract also to like the front end side, right? Of like connecting a web app to like on-chain transactions. The Truffle team is super, super OG. So I'm really fortunate that I guess I got onboarded through that team specifically because really I was just like accelerated on all things, everything. I don't know, like from the very basics, it's super open team, no stupid questions. And then this is actually kind of how I got into the L2 space. Was while I was at Truffle, one of the things they were potentially pivoting into was like tooling specifically geared towards multi-chain dApps, which was like, we were just emerging. The proliferation of L2s was kind of just happening at that time and has since increased. But yeah, that was my first introduction to like, I think a more in-depth view of what L2 development looked like. If I had not been working at Truffle at the time, I might not necessarily be working at like Scroll right now, for example. I attribute that a lot to, if you guys, anyone's familiar with Faina, I think her handle is Bitsplaining on Twitter, but she every week would do like a L2 roundup of like the most important, hottest topics across Twitter and just like collate them into like this 20 thread tweet or whatever. And she was super passionate about it. And she's like one of my mentors in the space. She now works at Optimism, I believe. But yeah, that was, I think, something I was really, really fortunate to have learned about and been exposed to at an early stage. That's kind of how I started. And that was also kind of how I started getting used to like, what does it look like to be a DevRel? Like that's when I got into live streaming and buying a fancy mic. Not that that's what DevRel is, but like, I don't know, just like other different ways of like content creation than I was used to, right? Like I said, I was a writer. I mean, it's more like a personal blog, but what does education look like outside of just like talking to a customer at a store? Like, I mean, maybe the equivalent would be like at a workshop, right? But like, how does that extend into public presentations and just like those kind of general soft skills that help translate like deeply technical content to something that's a bit more accessible? But anyways, so from Truffle, I moved on to Linea in 2023. I mean, the primary reason for that was transparently, right? We hit the bear market. ConsenSys was kind of reconsidering where it's going towards its resources. Truffle was just in the unfortunate position of being open source dev tooling. And they, I guess, diverting company resources to something that isn't like revenue positive is something that is a tough decision to make, but has to be made, especially when you're considering the bottom line. I don't know. Anyways, this is why I don't want to be an entrepreneur, because I don't want to think about things like this. Yeah, so then it just became a thing of like, Emily, we really like you. We want to keep you on, but you have to change teams. What do you want to do? So ConsenSys, I guess for those who aren't familiar with, I think they're most famous for being the company that has MetaMask, but they cover a very wide variety of projects, right? So Truffle being one of them, MetaMask being the most famous, I guess for developers in the space. If you're familiar with like Infura, they're a node provider. They do other projects like security auditing with diligence and other stuff, right? So basically became like, Emily, what do you want to work? You have three options. You have MetaMask, you have Infura, and we haven't launched this yet, but we're in the process of going like, it's going to go public test net in like a month or two. You can work on Linea. That to me felt like the perfect fit. I mean, one part because I was really interested in L2s just from my time of being like exposed to the mentors on my team. I think the other part that I really liked about being in like infrastructure dev tooling as compared to like, so I'll give you an example, right? So my sister works at 0x. For those who aren't familiar, 0x is a DEX aggregator. So they're very DeFi focused, right? So kind of the projects that she works on and the problems she thinks about are very DeFi specialized. Whereas Truffle is basically just your baseline tool to build any dApp ever. So in that sense, I get a very wide breadth of exposure to different verticals. So where she might know a lot about DeFi, I know a little bit about everything. So good and bad. And, there's positives and negatives to everything. I'll always feel stupid in a room at one point, and that's totally fine. I think like moving on to Linea is kind of like also a good fit in that sense because, as a chain, they are a generalized rollup, right? So in the same way I got at Truffle, I got a little piece of the pie everywhere on the Linea team. Or I knew that's what would enable me to do that. So I joined Linea 2023 before it was even called Linea, actually. So I was there when it was still ConsenSys ZKVM. The answer is no. They did not name it after me. I get that question a lot. there was an element I was like, can I leverage this as job security? No, but yeah, no. And then I was there from, I guess, before public testnet to when it was renamed to Linea to mainnet. And then when it launched, we got to 1 billion in TVL. And then I made my departure for Scroll about actually a month ago. So I have had some time to sit and kind of marinate, not a good word to use in my new role. It's been really, I think, interesting seeing how, I guess, again, how my brain can be stretched in different ways despite working like kind of like in the same part of the stack, if that makes sense.
So a lot of listeners to this podcast are enthusiastic about the graph. And so the name Linea, the name Scroll will be top of mind for most listeners because of recent integrations with the graph network. As you mentioned there, just a few months ago, you left Linea, you went to work at Scroll. Talk to us about what you're doing at Scroll and what makes Scroll different. I think a lot of listeners would like some education maybe from you about this part of the industry and why is Scroll unique?
Yeah. So I think a lot of the reason I moved to Scroll was I think there was a lot more room, like opportunity for growth. I would say what I really liked about Scroll was you work with a lot of different people, but I think Scroll has a much stronger global presence that I was really excited about, especially when it came to commitment towards emerging markets. I think the cynical side of me is like, I think a lot of projects in general will talk about how they care about like LATAM and Southeast Asia and things like that. And really, you kind of only saw LATAM get big maybe because DevCon went there, right? And then now Southeast Asia is getting really big because DevCon has it in Thailand, right? But like, what I thought was really cool about Scroll was like, we care about those regions. We have actually really talented people who work there, like live there, speak the language, which is already like culturally speaking wise, just having that native understanding of what it looks like. Super amazing. I think a really strong point for just like general health and ground building, especially since it is in these emerging markets where we first found the like actual use case for crypto. I think just that kind of narrative and ability to execute in these regions was really inspiring. The other piece that makes Scroll really interesting is like when you talk about ZK rollups in general, I don't know how many people are like familiar with the different types of ZK EVMs, right? But to just kind of briefly gloss over it, there's like 4 types. The fourth being the farthest away from EVM. That just means like from a developer experience wise, like coding, like your tools are going to change, right? So if you're used to using like Hardhat and Foundry, you'll probably have to download a plugin and unexpected things will show up that don't match exactly, right? Whereas something like Linea and Scroll are like, okay, we're going to go type 2. We are bytecode compatible. There should be like very minimal difference in developer experience. That's kind of the marquee headline, right? But I think when it comes to like actual seamless experience from like, hey, we are supporting, I'm getting really into the nitty gritty, but like supporting Sepolia from the start, I think is a really like already kind of demonstrates how committed you are to making sure you have parity with Ethereum. I think the other piece is like Scroll is really research oriented in the sense that we do things that I think move the space forward. So we're kind of like what I see Scroll as like a future looking chain, right? So there's an element of like, we are the only chain. I don't want to say only because the space moves so fast that eventually like somebody else also does it and they get salty in the background. So we are the only chain so far that I know until somebody corrects me otherwise that supports like all the curves necessary in order to use something like Noir. So when you comes to like building dApps with privacy preserving features, right, that requires very specific primitives on chain that Scroll as a ZK rollup offers that not others do. To that extent too, we just put out a proposal for something called L1s load. I guess also for the technical people in the audience, this means you can like read L1 state directly on the L2. From a practical point of view, this just makes like multi-chain way more accessible because if you think every L2 can now read directly from the L1, then that makes interoperability a lot easier and a lot smoother. So that is a roll-up improvement proposal we recently put out. And it's like little things like this, if like when you think about, where you want to be I think in the same way I moved from like B2B SaaS to crypto, and then within crypto, like who are the ones who are actually paving new ways to think about and improve tech, like outside of just maybe your bread and butter of being a roll up. That's kind of how I have fallen into, I guess, the space of, what I think makes Scroll really unique outside of just, because I think everyone can just be a chain, right? But it's more about like what you build on top of it. Be that the dApps you onboard, which are priority one, obviously, but then priority two, like how do you also invest your own internal resources into making sure like the ecosystem moves forward as a whole, right? So roll up improvement proposals. We're working on Scroll Pass, which is actually really cool. So I guess in general, if people are like, if anyone's here, like Zuzalu, Maxis, ZooPass, Scroll is helping to build out Scroll Pass, which is basically decentralizing and anonymizing ZooPass, right? And I don't know, it's just like these little things that are really fun and interesting and demonstrate how you can use blockchain in different ways is what makes Scroll really unique.
So as I mentioned earlier, a lot of listeners to this podcast are enthusiastic about the graph. And I believe you had interactions with the graph both at Linea and at Scroll. Can you just explain for the graph community the importance of the graph for someone in your role? You're working on the L2 side, you're trying to build a developer community, and here's this kind of partner or resource like the graph. Talk to us about how that fits into the story.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So like at the end of the day, like rollups are ecosystem builders. Our job is to onboard dApps and like fix the UX problem by being fast and cheap. But that's baseline, right? A dApp cannot exist without the other developer tooling and infrastructure needed, right? So for a lot of DeFi dApps, you're going to need something. And like for DeFi dApps as well with the graph, like you need oracles, you need indexers. These are things that are just baseline requirements in order to exist. So as like a rollup, both on the Linea side and on the Scroll side, I have to have graph because there are so many like existing dApps that we would want on our chain, right, to port over that require the graph. There are so many new use cases and new dApps that will need a product like the graph in order to succeed, right? So if we don't have that basic tool, then we are basically eliminating a whole cut of like whatever city we could be building on top of Scroll. You guys are key. Very, very, very important. I remember when I was Linea and then they're like, Emily, the graph is integrating. I was like, hallelujah, this is amazing. Like, we talk about developer experience and like EVM parity, right? But then I'm like, but yeah, okay. But if you don't have like, your most basic, like, and when I see saying the graph, because you guys are like one of the giants of like the indexer, like, I guess, ecosystem out there, right? Like it's just so hard to like bring on a really interesting project because they're going to go where their tools are.
And you work a lot with developers. And again, you have long pedigree on these chain side. One thing that makes the graph different is this commitment to decentralization. And I'm always curious, speaking with people sort of outside the ecosystem, how important that component of decentralization is. I mean, how do you think about that?
Yeah, well, that's a spicy question. So I think it really depends. Someone got mad at me about this at UCC because this is how I answered the question. From like a philosophical point of view, and I think why we're all in this together in crypto or Web3 is like decentralization is the core of our identity, right? Like we're here to beat out the centralized institutions that own our data, that like prevent us from, I don't know, transacting on a weekend, right? Like at its most basic, right? Being centralized is antithetical, I think, to the core of Ethereum's values, right? So I guess also when you talk about chains, you wanted to think about centralization as well. I think like Scroll is very, I also say this is kind of, it's a buzzword in the same way I think like a billion users in Flywheel is, but like Ethereum aligned, right? Like Scroll is definitely committed to decentralization. You need that for censorship resistance and all of those things. I personally think it's super important and it will, like, you have to have that. On the flip side, I think from interacting, and this comes from the side of being a chain has exposed me a lot to the user side of things. I think when I'm Truffle, I was exclusively talking to devs. Now I'm talking to users. And that's a whole different ballgame because each person has a degree of comfort in which they are okay with centralization, right? I mean, like we look at things like Solana is so popular. It is proof that there are people who are interested in blockchain who are not as concerned about decentralization. I think that's a fact. If you are a application or a user or, a person who actually cares about like security and decentralization and all the values and all, like, yes, you need the graph, you need a decentralized rollup. I think from a practical speaking point of view, like if you're thinking about users, the majority of the users won't notice. But regardless of that, I think like outside of Graph's decentralization position, which, I think is the number one, like there's a level of like you guys have really good infrastructure in place already, like a really good dev experience that makes you more than just being a decentralized indexer. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Yeah. So that was a really long answer. I don't know.
No, super helpful.
Yeah.
I want to ask you just a couple more questions before I ask you the GRTiQ 10. And I don't know if you got to see these, but these are 10 fun questions I ask each guest of the podcast every week. Gives us a chance to kind of get to know you a little bit better on the personal side. The first question is clearly coming out of ECC, and I think this has been a talking point in the industry for quite a while. There's this concern about we have the infra, now we need the dApps. What's your opinion on that argument, and how are you thinking through what all that might mean?
Yes, I get this question a lot. The answer is yes, I absolutely agree. I think it hurts my feelings because I've only ever worked on the infra side. It is absolutely paramount. I think a lot of times when people ask me about why, like, I guess my normal friends, okay, we're not normal, my non-Web3 friends ask me about it. And I can like tell them a lot of the reasons why blockchain is important. And I think it resonates with people, right? But then the next step of like, okay, Emily, you've convinced me. What can I do? How do I access this? Then the process just ends, right? Like if you don't have the dApp to actually have someone interested interact with it long term, like the story falls flat. And I think the thing that I think is really interesting is the story has always been like we need infrastructure in order to produce dApps. Maybe this is also my other hot take of that narrative to me is a bit of a crutch. Builders are super smart, in my opinion. They should be able to, like, infrastructure was not there. I think it was really, really, really hard to build a strong dApp. But I think it was possible. I think infrastructure in the regards of like something like a roll-up, like infrastructure preventing interaction and usage was what we needed, right? And so that's when I'm speaking specifically to like roll-ups as infrastructure. Like as long as Ethereum was expensive and slow, I don't think anything would have stuck, right? So that is an infrastructure that I think was requisite for a UX experience, right? Along the same lines of like when we talk about like how account abstraction got super duper hot. Was that like 2022? Was it also 2023? I don't remember, right? But that was like another type of infrastructure that was required for the UX problem, right? And so I think like we are at a place where we have good infrastructure in play to, I guess, basically support the part where you can't say like, I can't build dApps anymore, because there is a bit of a, like that onboarding process is somewhat removed. I think the other counter argument too, right? Maybe where it's like, oh, maybe Web3 UX is okay. It's like people will still use really difficult like financial instruments anyways. Like, do I understand how to file taxes? Not really, but I will. Yeah, I don't know. The other thing I think whenever people ask me that is I'm always like, yes, I absolutely agree. But also if I had the perfect idea, I would not be doing my job right now, and I would be building it. So I understand it as a really, really, I think, hard thing to execute on. You know, from a perspective of like, you have to want to be a founder and take on all that responsibility, right? And then the other half of like actually building it is also very, very difficult.
And then the second question was this. You mentioned account abstraction, and of course, every cycle, every sort of time within crypto, there's these themes that emerge as the things everyone's talking about. I don't know where we are in the present cycle. I don't know any of that type of stuff. But if you had to sort of project out based on your intuition what the themes will be this time around, do you have a sense for that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we just touched on it, right? The theme was consumer apps. Like I said, we've been saying infrastructure not being there is the reason we're not there yet. And the answer is like, yeah, we kind of are there, in my opinion, right? There's always improvements to be made, for sure. Absolutely. We have the MVP. So now we need to build the other MVP on top of our MVP. Does that make sense?
I think it does. I think it does.
Okay, perfect.
It's a good challenge for any listener out there who wants to get started. So, Emily, as I said, I now want to ask you the GRTiQ 10. These are 10 questions I ask each week. They're always the same. I ask them because I think it introduces listeners to new ideas, encourages them to try different things, or maybe even achieve more in their own lives. So, Emily, are you ready for the GRTiQ 10?
I hope so. Yes, absolutely.
The GRTiQ 10. This is the way.
10 questions for astronauts floating in space.
What book or article has had the most impact on your life?
Okay, I don't remember the name of it. I think it's something like Chase the Cheese or Get the Cheese.
Who Moved My Cheese or Who
Moved
the
My Cheese? I think is that the one where it's like humans have a really hard time finding the cheese and the mice are super nimble and like they can change on the fly and find the cheese properly. So I read that in like 4th grade, maybe. And I was like, okay, yeah, this is how I should act.
How about this one? Is there a movie or a TV show that you would recommend everybody should watch?
My taste in movies is probably like really mediocre. I love like 90s kind of era high school rom-com stuff. So if you want to watch 10 Things I Hate About You or like She's the Man, let me know.
How about this? If you could listen to only one music album for the rest of your life, which one would you choose?
Yeah, so I don't actually listen to a lot of music either, but there is one song that I will listen to over and over again, and it's Animals by Neon Trees.
What's the best advice someone's ever given to you?
Dress for the occasion. I'm really bad at like going to the gym, but you know, if you just force yourself to get into your athleisure or like your athletic clothes, like you'll end up at the gym, right? Same thing. Like, I don't know. If you're gonna go do something important, wear something nice. Set your mindset from like the outside.
Emily, what's one thing you've learned in your life that you don't think most other people have learned or know quite yet?
I don't know if people don't know this, but my catchphrase is everything in life is a trade-off. I think that helps to put things into perspective. It's very easy to get bogged down in things, but if you just think about like, is it more worth it to do X, Y, Z or not? It's super helpful. That's also the key, I think, to a happy relationship. I'm going to be honest. If we want to get into relationship advice, that is also my piece of relationship.
Yeah, it is good advice. What's the best life hack you've discovered for yourself?
Life hack. Okay, this is weird, but if your fish gets a little too fishy and you want to remove the taste, soak it in milk for maybe like an hour. You'll get rid of the fishy taste.
It's a great hack. And then, Emily, based on your own life experiences and observations, what's the one habit or characteristic that you think best explains how people find success in life?
That's really hard. I don't know. My general vibe is like, just try to be happy, man. Like, even if you're successful by all the traditional metrics, it doesn't feel like success if everything else is kind of a bleh.
And then the final 3 questions are complete the sentence type questions. The first one is, the thing that most excites me about the future of Web3 is?
Ownership.
And how about this one? If you're on X, I still always call it Twitter, you should be following?
Frogs without context.
And then the last question is this. Emily, I'm happiest when?
I'm with people I care about.
The GRTiQ 10.
And I show you how deep
Emily, thank you so much for joining the GRTiQ podcast. It was a lot of fun to get to know your personal story, the journey you took to where you are at Scroll now. I imagine a lot of listeners are going to want to follow you, stay up to date on the things you're working on, and learn more about Scroll and some of the things that are coming out of that community. What's the best way for them to connect?
Yeah, so my Twitter is @_EMJLIN. Otherwise, you can find out about all things Scroll at scroll_ZKP.
This is
production of the GRTiQ podcast. For more information, including detailed show notes, visit grtiq.com/podcast. That's grtiq.com/podcast.
Please consider contributing to this project and helping build the community by subscribing and leaving a review. GRTiQ Podcast.